Finally, Gamera returns to us in the form of Gamera Rebirth, a new series on Netflix made by the same people who made the Godzilla anime trilogy. Going into it, I didn't have super high expectations for this show considering how utterly garbage the Godzilla anime trilogy was. God, I can't stand how they handled those movies. Like, how do you make an anime of Godzilla that boring? Singular Point was better at retaining my attention at least, but even that didn't set a very high bar for kaiju stories in anime form, which is a damn shame. But this isn't Godzilla's video. Get the hell out of here, G-Man. It's time for the other G-Man. No matter how mid my expectations were, I was still excited as tits to see the new adaptation of Gamera, because it's been way too long since we've been graced with this juicy turtle goodness. Over 20 years with nothing but a bit of blue-balled hype back in like 2015. Does anyone remember that? I'll be keeping any spoilers as light as possible in this video, but if you haven't seen it yet and you want to go into it completely blind, then feel free to save this to your watch later playlist so you can, well, you know, watch it later. So with that being said, fasten your seatbelts, ladies and gentlemen, as your boy Kenniron takes you through all the ups and downs of Gamera Rebirth. So I actually really like the kids in the show, which is great because you spend the majority of the time following them and their story as they are basically being hunted by numerous kaiju. At first I was a little iffy about them. They showed plenty of promise from the start, don't get me wrong, but that doesn't necessarily equate to anything meaningful being delivered later on. As the episodes continued, however, we got to see a little more of each of their individual struggles, giving us insight into them as characters. They also did a solid job at showing us how they all felt about each other in the group, as well as developing those thoughts and relationships as time went on. Their chemistry together, while nothing groundbreaking, was entertaining enough to keep me watching, even when there were no giant monsters tearing each other to pieces. I also really appreciated how during the story, the human side of it focused almost entirely on these kids. Yes, you do see some quick scenes of other characters and what's going on in the world around them, like the monster fights for instance, but this is primarily their journey. They stick together for the majority of the series, and it really makes the story feel just a bit more tightly written as a result. You're not constantly jumping around trying to be filled in on what everyone else has been doing since we last saw them. It took me by surprise how little of it felt like unnecessary filler. And the personal stakes at play in the story, while lacking at first, definitely got ramped up to a better level by the end of it. Without giving anything away, I really liked that eventually these characters had to suffer the consequences of the things going on around them. But enough about them, let's talk about what we came here for. The kaiju, baby. First off, Gamera looks sick as hell. I am so glad they didn't go the route they did with the Godzilla anime trilogy with the character designs. It's not deviating too much from what we know Gamera to be. It's mostly just updating and modernizing him with what I can only describe as his most meanest looking self to date. In some of the older movies, he can come off as looking rather goofy, but they avoided that entirely. You take one look at him and you know. That's one badass dude right there. His abilities in the older movies can also seem really goofy, but again, they played it pretty straight here and make everything he does feel like it has weight to it and can do some serious damage. His power level in this is off the charts compared to any other iteration of him, which I like overall, but there is one minor issue I have regarding that, but I'll get to that in a bit. If Death Battle had used this version when they pitted him against Godzilla way back in the day, Gamera would have probably won hands down. Hell, even when compared to some of the newer iterations of Godzilla, he would still put up a hell of a fight. Just an absolute powerhouse, and I enjoyed watching every scene he was in. The other monsters are also updated extremely well, while paying homage to their older selves. I did see some fans, particularly on Twitter, not being quite as receptive to the Gyaos' new designs, but it wasn't a big deal for me. Some of the stuff they do gets pretty wacky too, But again, it's played off completely straight and taken so seriously that it doesn't even take you out of the experience. My personal favorite updated kaiju was Guiron. He is just an absolute beast at the way he flips around trying to slice up any and everything in sight was an absolute blast to watch. All of the fight scenes in general were just incredibly well done, and for that alone, I absolutely want to see more of this. And kind of an add-on to that, the brutality in this anime actually kind of shocked me at first. Not just with the monsters, but with the people too. There's parts where characters are getting stabbed, eaten, dismembered, blown the hell up, the whole 9 yards. Gamera media has always been more kid-oriented, so I really enjoyed finally getting to see an edgier, more adult side to it. Even more so than the Heisei trilogy did way back in the day. Characters even start throwing around F-bombs, and when I heard the first one, I was like, yes, thank you. Finally, people are running around in heated situations and actually talking like they're in heated situations. Two final positives I'll mention real quick are the military and the music. The military starts off being kinda dumb, but just like any other character, they go through a little bit of an arc where they learn who's a problem and who's not. And it's just so satisfying that they aren't completely antagonistic the entire time. Like an actual military force, they take the information they are presented with and learn from that to adapt their approach accordingly. I get so sick and tired of watching a film or show where the military just make the absolutely wrong decisions again and again and again, and finally, the music. It wasn't anything outstanding, but that's not to say it was bad. It is in the upside section of this video after all. The somber moments were elevated with somber music, the action scenes were elevated with rock, and the impending doom sequences had dark foreboding music. It all fit the tone, elevated the scenes, and helped keep you in the story, and that's exactly what it's supposed to do. So props to the composer, or composers. I'm not sure who all worked on the music in this, and I'm honestly a bit too lazy to look it up. And that's my final point for the positives of this series. Now let's look at the stuff I just straight up didn't like about it. Trust me, there is a little bit to talk about here. But before we do, if you're enjoying the video so far, send a like my way and consider subscribing. It's the quickest and easiest way to let me know you want to see more content like this, so what are you waiting for? Now I want to preface this by saying the things I enjoyed about this, I really enjoyed. And I don't want to sound super cynical in this part of the video, but rather I want to offer some critiques. Feedback like this is important in helping understand what worked and what didn't, so that maybe next time it can be even greater. But with all that said, I really have some grievances with the bigger overarching story at play here. It's kind of not there and feels like, as a certain Charlie would describe it, a nothing burger for the big portion of the series. We're following these kids who keep getting chased down by kaiju, and for over half of it, that's pretty much all that's going on. You have the usual story beats of all the characters trying to get an idea of what's happening with all the monsters showing up and why, but it doesn't actually get anywhere until the moment the villains reveal themselves. And when the villains do reveal themselves, the overarching story delves into a bit of a convoluted mess. The villainous plan here is very hokey, to the point where it rivals some of the worst James Bond villains. And most of the time, their logic doesn't make sense. Not to mention, we never learn of any good motivations behind their plan. Some of them talk amongst themselves about things that happened in the past before the audience is ever clued into it. And in the end, I don't think we are ever properly clued into it at all. It leaves the audience feeling a bit alienated to the things going on within the story to a certain extent. Then when something doesn't go the way the villains want it to, they talk about, oh, we have a contingency plan. Like they're super smart and know exactly what they're doing, but it ends up feeling shoehorned in for more content, inevitably falling flat as there's no more emotional weight to it. Not to mention that the writers try not once, not twice, not 3 times, hell, I've lost count by now, but they try a lot of times to do little twists and turns in the story, and like maybe half of one of them feels truly earned. But back to the villains, it's like after a while, if the plan has gone to shit to the point where it feels like you're on plan Z in the span of 20 minutes, you should probably just cut your losses and try again. Or retire from villainy altogether because you're obviously not good at it. What's even worse is that the second to last episode feels like it should be the last episode. And the last episode feels again like it's shoehorned in to have a bit more kaiju action. I legitimately thought towards the end of the second to last episode that the very last episode was just going to be us following the characters as they deal with the aftermath of everything and just tying up their personal and emotional stories. And I really wish that's what we got. But then it turns out there's more to it because the villains are still salty about everything. I don't want to continue rambling now, but what I'm getting at is that when a story goes in this direction, which is seemingly no clear and concise direction at all, it makes the villains, the people who are inevitably driving said overarching story, come off as almost completely incompetent. Thankfully, as I stated before, the audience gets to focus mainly on the kids and their journey, but the villains have to be written better than this if you want them to be taken more seriously. So that's the biggest issue I have with the series. My second biggest issue is when the story tries to involve Gamera, it's structured almost exactly the same in every episode. He comes in to save the day at the last minute every single time. He is the living embodiment of a Deus Ex Machina. Each episode gets a very monster of the week feel to it as a result. And while it's cool that we get to see more monsters as a result of this, and it's not necessarily a bad thing to structure the show this way, the way it's executed is what largely contributes to the overarching story feeling non-existent for the larger portion of the series. Not to mention that the constant Deus Ex Machinization of him gives a very strong sense of plot armor to many of the characters. We see quite a few of the monsters use their abilities to just slaughter nameless characters on sight. But when it comes to the other characters that the story actually cares about, it's like all of a sudden the current monster forgets its insta-kill capabilities because Gamera isn't there to save the day just yet. And I believe there is technically a story element to explain that in a few of the cases, but it's never discussed or shown to us in a way that makes it seem like it was meant for the audience to connect those dots. In other words, the execution, or literal lack thereof, is just not it. Speaking of monsters forgetting their insta-kill capabilities, Gamera himself has an ability that he uses to end 2 separate fights. It seems like an instant win for him every time he uses it, but when you never see it fail, it begs the question, why not just start every single fight with it? It doesn't seem to be particularly draining of his energy, yet he kind of acts like it's only meant for a last resort. Granted, if he always resorted to that one ability, it wouldn't lend itself to being very interesting choreography-wise. Even still, it rubbed me the wrong way just a bit. He also just forgets in one scene in particular that he can bite stuff too. He finds himself in a bit of a pickle, which he can seemingly just bite down on the enemy kaiju and it would greatly help him out of it. The scene drags out a little while for the emotional impact, but that emotional impact is completely lost when all I'm doing is screaming, "Bite his ass, bite him, chomp, chomp, chew, chew, motherfucker." One more thing about Gamera that bugged me was that his psychic link to the child he's linked to is completely thrown out of the window for a majority of the runtime. Any fans out there remember how in the old movies, whenever he was psychically linked to somebody, anytime he felt pain, they would feel it too. Well, they have that in this series. Surprise, surprise, it's almost like you're watching Gamera or something, but it's only present for 1 or 2 scenes. They still show that they're linked in other ways, but there's one scene in particular where the kid he's linked with just randomly starts feeling his pain for no reason at all. literally no reason. And the rest of the time when Gamera is taking a beating, the kid is perfectly fine. It was just extremely inconsistent, and most of the runtime you kind of forget that it's even a thing. Back to the fight scenes though, they did this little composition technique where they showed the exact same moment of a fight, but they would replay it from a different angle, sometimes more than once. Like, there'd be a hard hit that sways the fight in one way or the other, and to give it more of a bigger sense of impact, you'd hear the same sound effects again, and you'd get a damn NFL Sunday instant replay of it, which that in itself isn't a terrible thing to do, but when they kept using it as repetitively as they did, it became really jarring and took me out of the scene completely for a moment, mitigating any impact they were trying to force me to have when watching it. Like, yes, I was watching. I saw it the first time. I don't need to see it again. There was also one more thing that kept taking me out of the scenes as well. This is hands down my most nitpicky complaint, but I really can't help it. It just did a number on me. Like, somebody call an ambulance. No, but seriously, when Gamera is flying around, his arms are more akin to the little sea turtle flipper thingies with jet boosters in them. But when he's standing and fighting, he obviously has claws which he can ball into fists. So in the very first episode, when I saw the flipper flyers, the very first thought that popped in my mind was, oh, that's cool. I wonder how they're going to animate his arms changing back when he lands. And guess what? They never animate his arms changing. They always have him land or take off behind an explosion or in the water or something else so that he can hide his arms from the audience while they change. And the first time I saw that decision, I immediately knew, oh, so it's going to be like that for the whole series then, huh? And I was absolutely right. I mean, look, I get it. That shit would have been difficult and maybe even a little silly looking to animate. But like, you could have come up with something. I don't know, like I said, this is one that's pretty minor, but it did make me think of the studio and the guys animating everything behind the scenes every time I saw it, which left a crack in my suspension of disbelief for a brief period. But that's really all the negative things I noticed in this, and to be honest, they are far outweighed by the positive stuff. However, there are still a few things that I would put in a bit of a mixed category, so let's move on with it. So when I say mixed, I mean that there are certain things that have both positive and negative elements about it to me. But I also mean that there are just some things that I might need a little more time to mull over and really make up my mind about. So first is the animation, as I'm really on the fence about it. On the one hand, I think the kaiju themselves, their battles, explosions, and the water effects all look really nice with this style of animation. But on the other hand, I think the human characters look pretty atrocious in comparison to other animated media. And I've always felt this way, even dating back to the first Godzilla anime movie. Just something about them seems relatively lifeless. Like, there were scenes, for instance, of a guy starting to chew some bubblegum while interacting with another character. And I just kept waiting to actually see him chew the bubblegum. And it just never happened. Choo choo, motherfucker. The monsters look so phenomenal, no doubt about it, but the people can look so janky and stiff sometimes, and it makes me wonder if this is just a byproduct of this 3D style of animation, or if it's really just a case of limited resources where the focus has to be on the monsters, and they just didn't have enough time or money or both to animate the humans quite as well. After all, it is the monsters we're all watching this for. If you have an answer to that, let me know in the comments down below. I'm genuinely curious about that. The Irelium is another thing I'm really not sure how I feel about. For those that haven't seen it yet and don't know what it is, this isn't spoilers, it's kind of just there, but it's a crystal substance that all these kaiju kind of use as an energy source for them. If they make more seasons, I'll probably form a more solid opinion on it, as I'm sure they'd continue to utilize it within the story. But for now though, it seems a bit too similar to the red dust from Godzilla Singular Point, which I'm not a fan of, and began to make the story more convoluted when it had a more prominent role in it, which I'm also not a fan of. Then again, it gives the kaiju a unique look, and I love the inclusion of its energy to their designs, especially for Gamera himself. Also, the fight scenes in this series, and this may just be me, but they seemed a bit short. I think it adds a certain sense of realism, as in real life, unless you're on almost the exact same level as your opponent, fights tend to be relatively short-lived, but it also leaves me feeling like I wanted to see just a little bit more. Not like an anime-style stare-down where the two are just monologuing in their head, which would be a bit difficult to do with giant monsters anyways, but just trading a few extra blows back and forth at least. And my last mixed opinion, the after credits scene. Everything these days just has to have one. But I don't want to get too much into the spoilers, so I won't say anything except for that. The first half of it was really fun to see, I enjoyed it, and then the second half of it just took away a lot of the emotional impact that the story had going for it. And that's really all my thoughts put out there. In the end, I had a blast watching the show, and I really hope we get more Gamera content in the future. But with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and Kenniron out. Why the fuck is it called Rebirth?